Artists were starting to talk about her, musicians were talking about her. It also seemed like a new core of writers were writing about her. I did try to break through some of that hype, but also really ground it in the concrete of the world in which Joan Didion lived in and wrote in. So I wanted to sort of connect things back to a kind of reality. There was a point to why she wrote in first person. I think one of the things so many of us love about Joan Didion is her mastery of that personal essay format that brought in more literary elements of fiction from theater writing, from poetry, that didn't just try to be this just the facts dry writing. New journalism was the highest literary form of the late 60s, and she was, of course, the queen of it.
Welcome to Angel City Culture Quest, where art, social justice, and the environment meet in Los Angeles. I am your host, Melina Paris, and I welcome you to this episode. Hi, folks. Thank you for tuning in to Angel City Culture Quest. Today, our guest is Evelyn McDonnell. Evelyn and I are going to be discussing her book, The World According to Joan Didion. Here's a little bit of information about Evelyn. Evelyn McDonnell has written or edited 8 books, from Rock She Wrote, Women Write About Rock, Pop, and Rap, to The World According to Joan Didion. Her articles for the Miami Herald, The Village Voice, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Billboard, Ms., and elsewhere have won numerous awards. She is a professor of journalism and faculty director of media, arts, and a just society at Loyola Marymount University. Hello, Evelyn. Thank you for coming.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so happy to discuss this wonderful book with you.
Thank you.
The conversation about this book happening started even before Joan Didion died. In discussing why you wrote this book, you noted Joan commanded both interest and hype, which you felt curious about, and also in some ways maybe irritated by. Can you talk about what piqued your curiosity and your irritation?
Yes, I did start talking with the editor and publisher and my agent about some kind of book on Joan Didion within the year of her dying, but we just noticed that there was so much social media talk about her. This actually had been building for years from an Instagram posts, and just that she seemed to have commanded the attention of a younger generation. Artists were starting to talk about her, musicians were talking about her. Of course, she's been known by writers for a long time, but it also seemed like a new core of writers were writing about her. And so we were trying to figure that out, like what was her enduring appeal, but also maybe trying to break through some of that hype, the cult of St. Joan, as a writer has said before, to maybe bring it back to the reality of who she was. And then she died. And of course, we knew that she had been sick, that she'd had Parkinson's for several years, which is part of what held me back from writing about her, because I knew it's hard to write a bio about someone who is living. Hard to get their permission, their access to them. Certainly a figure as vaulted as Joan Didion. And then also because we knew that she was sick. In her latter years, she was losing the power of speech. It was not the right time to be trying to ask permission to do something with her. So when she died, it was almost like, okay, well, now there's a story here to be told, the end to the narrative. She was always so interested in narrative. So now there was an end. And also there was so much attention paid to her death. There were so many articles, there were covered stories of magazines. But 3 months later, again, we could see that there was just general cultural interest beyond the world of journalism or literature or filmmaking. Also fashion and music, and that continued to grow. All the musicians writing about her. I wanted to explain that and try to explain it in a way that hopefully wasn't just feeding into the hype, having some kind of critical lens, but also really grounding it in the concrete writing, the concrete of her words, and also the concrete of the world in which she lived in and wrote in, because she wrote so spectacularly and meticulously at the same time about place and geography. That was one of her strengths. So I wanted to travel to those places that she wrote about, those places that she lived. She mostly wrote about places that she had lived in, to sort of connect things back to a kind of reality.
I think you succeeded in that. I do want to note it was beautiful how you mapped and went to all the places that she lived so you could explain them to the readers. You really captured the physicality of it, the geography of it, even the feeling of it, I think. So
Thank
I
you.
just want to praise you on that because that's a unique gift, I think, to be able to share, especially from somebody who lived in these places.
And of course, I was steeping myself in Joan's writing the entire time.
Yeah.
So I was, in a sense, learning at the hand of a master and trying to
Wow.
do
That's
my best
great.
to live up to her high standards. And of course, not succeeding, but but at least
No, I think you
role
did.
model.
I
Yeah.
would say you did. You were objective, but at the same time, you helped us step into her shoes.
And I should also say that one of the things I was trying to navigate, like we talked about like the kind of hype around here, and there was also a growing, I would say, counter reaction to the hype. And other writers were really starting to attack her prominence and some of what she wrote with absolutely valid grounds. And also, she presented a contradictory figure because her politics changed, her writing style changed, where she lived changed. There was a kind of transformation. So I was also trying to explore what was that transformation, but what remained the core of Joan Didion through it all.
Yeah, you captured it. And that's what we're going to discuss a lot about is the transformation and the contrasts as well. So before she died, as you explained, this book was trying to do a biography of a person who's still alive, which is never easy, especially for a public figure. And in her case, getting her permission might have been impossible, as she was already quite sick with Parkinson's. After she died, it was no longer a question of trying to get her permission. It had a context of also trying to explain her legacy in the wake of a ton of articles, which you mentioned, that came out after she died. So, in that context of her legacy, did that feel like more pressure for you, or was it liberating as you aimed to reconcile the opposing views of her?
Oh, it was an intense and immense pressure
No.
to write about someone who is so well known and so well loved and also acutely hated by some and is such a vaulted figure. And while I am a journalist, my first book was actually about women journalists. Rock She
Mm.
Wrote, edited with Ann Powers, was a collection of articles by women journalists. And I'm a journalism professor at LMU. So it's certainly a world I know well, but I'm known to write more about music and
Yeah.
women musicians. That to take on a literary figure as large as Joan Didion was definitely scary,
Huge.
daunting, intimidating, and knowing also how poorly she suffered fools. Thankfully, not having to worry about what she would say about it, but certainly what people that knew her well would say, and those who really claim her as their own. And I will definitely say that a lot of people felt like I was an interloper into her world and their world.
The people
So
you spoke to.
maybe some of the people I spoke to, but just a
Mhm.
kind of New York literati. Because then there's an irony in this. I'm based in California. I was originally from California, as was Joan. And these were battles that she fought in her youth as well, was to be accepted by the New York literati. Publishing industry is, centered in New York. I had also lived in New York, so I related to that.
You're well aware. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would say the liberating part of it was what a pleasure to immerse myself in Joan Didion's world for a couple of years and her mind and her writing, and to find letters and articles that I hadn't seen before, had not been shared.
How many years was it that you were working on it?
It was a year of writing and a year of editing and publicizing and marketing,
Yeah, that's a good
but
chunk of time.
and a year of research and writing. But that I did it as quickly as I did. I don't really understand how I did it as quickly. Except I just locked myself in my writer's office, as Joan would do.
Yeah, and fascinating material.
And I've written about other subjects that were not as pleasant to spend that much time with. And even though, again, not everything about Joan Didion is great, but certainly her writing, even those who criticize her have to hand it that she
Respect her
knew how to
writing.
put words together.
Yeah, definitely. So You did answer my question about was it at all daunting to write so deeply about another author? But this was initially an unexpected surprise. But as a reader, I enjoyed your voice in this book. It worked. Notably, the parts about Portuguese Bend in Palos Verdes, and you brought yourself seamlessly into it. With you and your husband, who likes to drive fast on that landslide road near Portuguese Bend. And earlier, you had recalled riding in the backseat of your mom's car with your brother down Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu with that great 70s music playing on the radio. Why did you choose to inject your personal voice into this book?
It's funny because that's probably the most disputed part of the book, my use of personal voice. Some people love it and some people hate it. And of course, it's one of the things that Joan Didion was known for doing. So I felt in that sense that I had her permission to do it. And there was a point to why she wrote in first person and why I wrote in first person. It's not to be making the story about me, and she wasn't necessarily writing about herself, but the use of first person is a way to provide entry points for readers who may be daunted by the material or who may not trust who the narrator is and want some background of who the person is before they dive in. It just helps to understand these general concepts and that they're related to actual lives. And a big part of that is also for both Joan and it was for me for validating her perspective as a woman. The famous opening line to her first essay for Life magazine. I'm writing this article in the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in lieu of filing a divorce. So just putting herself out there
Exactly.
for
Yeah.
personal laundry. And then, I'm telling you this in order for you to understand exactly who I am and why I am. So I think one of the things so many of us love about Joan Didion is her mastery of that personal essay format. And so I saw this book as being a series of personal essays inspired by her writing, connected to her actual life, and trying to show how her thought and her expression developed as she moved around the world and as I moved around the world in her footsteps.
That's really, especially for the time that she was doing this writing, it's actually kind of profound, for a woman in the publishing world to take the reins and do that.
Well, and of course, the irony of that first Life magazine story was that what she had wanted to write when she was given this opportunity of a column was to write about the Vietnam War. And the editor was like, "Oh no, the guys are over there covering that. Don't worry your pretty little head, Joan."
Yeah.
Sure, they didn't say that, but instead, it's that way in which we're forced into writing about our personal lives.
That's true. That's a good point.
In a way, she weaponized that.
And like you said, could you imagine what she would have actually written had she been able to go to Vietnam? That would have been amazing.
Yeah.
Really important. So you discovered Joan in college. She is formative in your writing very early in your career, and you read her periodically throughout your life. But both of you share more personal connections and similar pathways. And there's several great passages about that on page 27 in the book. Can you talk about some of these significant connections between you and Joan?
Sure. So one of the things I really liked about her from the moment I was introduced to her in a journalism class at Brown University as an undergraduate was that she was a California writer, born in Sacramento, fifth generation California, and a lot of what she wrote about was California. And I'm actually just a third generation California, but still it's pretty rare to be someone who has multiple lineages.
Yeah.
Can go back multiple generations in this state. But we moved when I was 4, but I never felt that connected growing up in Wisconsin or going to college in Rhode Island. I always felt like I was a California that had been separated from her homeland. And so reading this writer that was writing about California and who was a woman, I think that made me dive deeper. And of course, it was also just the power of her writing and of that new journalism that she was part of. I was inspired by that.
Can you describe new journalism?
Yeah, so new journalism was a term that was used in the late 60s, so it was new then. And sometimes it's called literary journalism now, though I don't think they're quite the same things. But going back to the thing about first person, one of the goals of new journalism was to say that the neutral, supposedly objective voice of the journalist that had become the standard of journalism because of the power of broadcast news at that time, that there is no objectivity and that everybody has their own personal subjective history that shapes what news they're drawn to and how they're telling it. And so many new journalists wrote in first person, like Joan. She wasn't the only one. And then also writing journalism that brought in more literary elements, fiction, from theater writing, from the poetry, that didn't just try to be this just the facts dry writing, that tried to be beautiful writing as well as reported investigations. Also, an immersive element in new journalism was to just go and embed yourself in Haight-Ashbury, as Joan did, Slouching Towards Bethlehem. So new journalism was the highest literary form of the late 60s. It modeled itself after the novel and then it overthrew it. And she was, of course, the queen of it.
Yeah.
You know, I loved the fact, and I still love the fact that she wrote about things like Haight-Ashbury and the counterculture and the Doors and Joan Baez, things that I was also interested in. However, she's my mother's age. We're different generations. But I sort of liked hearing her perspective. And when she wrote about things like Haight-Ashbury, she wrote about them with a skepticism that I felt was different from a lot of her peers. So I sort of see her as a mother figure to myself as a writer and a journalist, and seeing that sense of having been someone who had a strong connection to California, which is my home, finding that again, trying to follow her in her footsteps. And I will say that like this all happened in college, and then I sort of stepped away, but then I would periodically go back, or I would read the new books and rediscover her.
And were you in New York the same years that she and her husband were there?
We actually did. Yes, I was in New York. Of course, she stayed in New York and I left in 2001. But yes, so I was also in her orbit. I never had an interaction with her or with her daughter, Quintana, who was my age. Although I feel certain that Quintana and I must have been at some of the same shows, and Joan and I probably. And so when she writes about the Central Park Five, I was at the Village Voice, which was the only other place outside of the Black media that really critiqued that case.
Yeah, and you explore that, the exploration of Didion as an activist journalist on the misconduct of the investigation into the wrongful arrest of the Central Park Five.
When she came to New York, she became a very fierce political reporter. She covered conventions and she covered elections, and she turned all her sense of skepticism and fine writing that she had looked at Hollywood and the rock scene in California, she turned it on
politics. That's good. If you're just tuning in, today we're talking to Evelyn McDonnell about her book, The World According to Joan Didion. Thank you for listening. Hi folks, this is your host, Melina Paris. Angel City Culture Quest is growing. We're barely into our third year now, and there's so much more quest-worthy inspiration to bring you. Art, books, film, coverage of local events, and more. We've gotten a new QR code, so you can capture episodes on the go, because I know you're busy. We've been creating artistic flyers unique to each episode, and new Angel City Culture Quest stickers. And there's more to come. As you know, there are costs to keep this podcast going. So, if you're able, join me in this quest with your support. Think of it as a cultural tip jar to share any amount that you're comfortable with. Even a few dollars a month will contribute to my ability to continue bringing you the great work of these artists, activists, and others, and the cultural content that you want to hear about. I would be honored to have your support. To donate, please go to my Patreon link at patreon.com/Angel City Culture Quest. There, you can also see all of our past episodes. Thank you. So, you also mentioned you're very curious about her relationship to the natural world. And you have that curiosity too, with your love of the ocean and all things water. Do you see yourself looking into this aspect of Joan further, possibly when her unreleased papers come out from the New York City Library?
Who knows?
You've done the book.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I've done this book, but there's so much more to write. And that's certainly an aspect of her that I'm also drawn to. I mean, she said that she wanted to be a marine scientist.
Yeah.
I'm also a major ocean lover. And
Yeah.
I feel like some people have really missed this aspect of her. She's been called an urbanist, which I do understand because she also did write about New York perhaps better than people who were born there. And she spent a lot of her life in New York. But she said that the landscape of the Central Valley influenced her so much. And so she wrote about the light of California and the ocean and the Santa Ana winds. I think she always had to have that sense of nature that she grew up with in
Hmm.
Sacramento. And then that's why she moved to Portuguese Bend to overlook the ocean. That's why she moved to Malibu up the coast to overlook the ocean again. And I think that she would have preferred to stay out west or to move to Hawaii. But it was her husband, John Gregory Dunn, who was from Connecticut, who I think felt he had done his time in her part of the
Yeah.
country and was having health issues and I think wanted to be back in New York. And obviously, she stayed there for decades after he passed too. So she reconciled with being there.
Yeah. Another transition. So we're going into transition and feminism. I'm going to mention a passage here, so bear with me because I want to quote it correctly. But first of all, you noted Joan's life transitions, both personally and professionally. She breaks away from things like place and to an extent her upbringing and conservatism, but also from starting at Vogue magazine in the 1950s compared to how she ultimately made space for herself professionally in the writing and publishing world. On page 218, there's a passage that stuck out to me in the chapter Diner. There were two passages, in fact. But in the first one, you wrote about her 1978 speech at Berkeley titled The California Woman, which is a title that she regretted for its generalization, you noted. Her speech praised specific and, you noted, all-white California women. The passage reads, "The talk is kind of a lodestone key to summation of Didion's world. Here is her great subject, the American Empire. Joan visited London and Paris in the fall prior. She writes, quote, 'It seemed to me then that all of America was very far away.' All caps. I felt it viscerally as the New World," end quote. And then you said, as she flew back to Los Angeles, quote, "The enormity of that empty space between our own coasts struck me as it had not in years. We are still different here. We are still looking to the Orient rather than to Europe," end quote. So you explain here is her disillusionment with the frontier myth of the Golden State and her own family's role in it. So I'm curious, could this also address California's embrace of the East and its history and customs at that time, sort of like
Yeah.
with music and yoga, rather than simply and automatically beholden to those same hallmarks of the Western world?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was really struck when I found this speech because people say that she wasn't interested in feminism, and clearly she was interested in women. And this was an example of it, of writing about women. But also, this is just so clear how she has an understanding of America that is very different from what a lot of Easterners think of in the publishing world, who looks down at that space between the coast and just calls it the flyover and doesn't understand it. And Joan understood it because she grew up in more rural California and she also traveled through the South. And I just think that that shows how at core she was a West Coast California writer. And yes, I think that there is a way in which being here in California, you're so much more exposed to Asia, to the East, as well as to Mexican culture and Latin American culture.
Yeah, it all permeates.
Yeah, and I think that clearly, especially the Latin influence in Joan's
Mm.
life, and she was famous for making Mexican chicken. She named her daughter kind of weirdly after,
Yeah. It's a name of a town in Mexico.
yes, Quintana Roo. Yeah. So the thing about her disillusionment with the frontier myth of the Golden State and her own family's role in it, this was really this transformation that I traced in her writing. To understand Joan Didion, you really have to read her book, Where I Was From, because it's where I was from. It's a collection of pieces that she wrote, and it's something she spent years writing, but did not publish until after both of her parents were dead. She had such a strong relationship to her mother in particular. Family was paramount to her that she didn't want to reveal that she didn't believe the whole golden myth of the Golden State as this
Yeah.
beautiful frontier that she had been fed as a fifth generation Californian. And she turns her back on it at the end of this book. And she, at that point, moved back to New York. And I think that a lot of the people who criticize Joan as being this very white writer and not acknowledging that, they need to read that book, I think, more carefully. She criticizes her own first novel, literally deconstructs herself. She could have taken it further. She never really addressed what happened to the Native people of California. She called herself the native daughter. She's not a native, right? I just said I'm a native California. Yeah, it's really problematic language, obviously. But I think for her generation and for having grown up with parents who were very conservative, her mother was fascinated with John Birch Society, that she really...
It was a big step.
Yeah, I think that she had that kind of self-reckoning. It took her a long time to come out and say it, when she really transitioned to writing more about politics, too.
And I like the way you incorporated that into the book about Native people and the histories and the opportunist in California in those gold rush days who kind of latched on to whatever the best opportunity for him was.
Yeah, Sutter, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
But once the gold was discovered, how you just put it out there, the native tribes in the area didn't have a chance because people found gold.
Right.
So kudos for pulling that into this narrative as well, along with how she worked through this process. There's another connection you did through writing.
Yeah, and another thing, she did primarily write about America, this hemisphere, or the Pacific Rim. She didn't write about Europe. I lived in New York for a dozen years, in Miami. I lived in Rhode Island for 6 years. The East Coast still looks across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. And here in the West, we look across the Pacific to Asia and Hawaii and Pacific Islands.
I like how you identified that and wrote that down because there's a distinct difference. So, a feminist or not? Joan didn't call herself a feminist, but you said she was very supportive of, or she is very interested in, what women were actually doing. As a screenwriter, she fought to create nuanced, unstereotypical female characters in movies such as A Star is Born and The Panic in Needle Park. Yet she had what you call blindered privilege, which leads me to how you blended the modern and the old in many parts of this book. One example you point to is her essay, The Women's Movement. Joan writes, that many women are victims of condescension and exploitation and sexual stereotyping is scarcely news. But neither was it news that other women are not. Nobody forces women to buy the package. You observed many women, particularly without her race and class advantages, were and are precisely forced to buy the package. Then you land that with hashtag me not could have been Joan's hashtag. Can you talk about this contrast?
Yeah, so I would say in general, Joan Didion was someone who was very skeptical of movements, of activism, really. She didn't trust people's motives, and she was very much a loner and kind of elitist. And that was probably a blindness of hers. And it's particularly notable given that she was coming to fame in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can say that activism actually did achieve things, and that there's was a power to what was to good trouble, as they said.
Yeah.
And so this is one of the critiques that have been made with her, and I'm like, yes, I agree with that. That piece on the women's movement was largely a critique. Now, it was also because this was her journalistic skepticism. She always had to be critical, and so wasn't going to just raise the flag or for burning bras, right? Or whatever.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just that she didn't claim herself as a feminist. But on the other hand, she was incredibly interested in women's lives, wrote about groundbreaking women, Georgia O'Keeffe or Patty Hearst, Martha Stewart. All of her main characters in her books are women. She was clearly interested in their interior lives. I discovered an article that she wrote for Mademoiselle magazine very early in her career when she was in New York, critiquing the publishing world of San Francisco for its sexism. She just wasn't someone who got on the bus.
Exactly. Or in the street, as you said.
Yeah. So she did still inherit from her family that sense of party individualism more than collective problem solving.
Yeah, that's true. And thank you for highlighting that, because I think that's an important aspect, as you said, to really get down to what she was about. What do you admire most about her?
Many things. But I will say that even through all the change that she made in her point of view and her transformation politically, she still always had this very strong sense of what she called character in her famous article, Self-Respect, for Vogue magazine, which is one of her more iconic pieces of writing and one of her earliest pieces of writing. Like she had a really strong sense of a kind of moral fiber or integrity. She always came back to these bedrock values of family, of criticism, of criticizing corruption, of looking for the snakes in the grass.
Yeah.
Which she wrote repeatedly about snakes, a whole chapter about snakes in my book.
Yeah.
And that she, even in the midst of admitting that she was wrong in her book, Where I Was From, she still stood up for the sense. And that was part of her sense of integrity, was to go, you know what? If I'm going to critique others, I have to admit that I've also been complicit in this false narrative.
The honesty, the integrity.
Yes. And I think one of the things that I really learned about her in the process of researching her life and writing this book and reading her letters and reading some of her early versions of manuscripts was that even though she seemed kind of austere and forbidding and the woman of few words, intimidating in her public persona and even in her writing sometimes, that personally she was actually very loving and generous and kind to her family, to the people, to her friends, to people that she worked with, and that she also had a great sense of humor. And in her letters, and also in much of her writing, that kindness and warmth comes through.
The side we don't get to know about or see of hers.
I think that she really wanted to be taken seriously, so she didn't necessarily present herself that way in public. She was also famously shy and reticent, but I think there was also a way for her to just control how she was projected to the world. It was like her giant sunglasses, right?
Right. It was the armor in a way.
Yeah. Sunglasses was this mirthful, warm eyes.
Yep. Well, you captured it beautifully, Evelyn, and this, I have to say, is a pleasure to read. It's a pleasure to hear your voice, and it's a pleasure to read Joan through you and how she moved about in the world. And you made clear why she is such an icon. So thank you for that.
Do you want me to read a short passage?
Please. Yes.
Let's see. I'm going to read one maybe that explains a little bit about the book and also has some great quotes from Joan in it.
Great.
So it's from page 2. We live in an age of reckonings over who gets to tell stories and how and why. Didion faced this abyss as a young woman beginning her career and her family, and her transparency about this dissolution was her and our saving grace. Quote, I've had to struggle all my life against my own apprehensions, my own false ideas, my own distorted perceptions, she said in a commencement address at the University of California, Riverside in 1975. I've had to work very hard, make myself unhappy, give up ideas that made me comfortable, trying to apprehend social reality. I've spent my entire adult life, it seems to me, in a state of profound culture shock. I wish I were unique in this, but I'm not. Didion expressed many of her foundational concepts first in speeches like these, mostly at universities to younger audiences. This is part of what has made her legacy so transformative for multiple generations. She was literally speaking to us, passing on what she had learned. Quote, it takes an act of will to live in the world, which is what I'm talking about today, she said at Riverside. By living in the world, I mean really trying to see it, look at it, trying to make connections. And that's not easy. It takes work. You have to keep stripping yourself down, examining everything you see, getting rid of whatever is blinding you. Then she offered this advice. Throw yourself into the convulsion of the world. So I'll end at that.
Bravo. That's amazing. Have to read that whole speech. That would be amazing to read.
Yeah, it would have been amazing to be there to hear it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Evelyn. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. And thank you for doing your podcast and shining a light on culture and the arts, especially here in
the Harbor area.
Yeah, the Harbor area.
Well, thank you. So tell us, where can people find you with your blog, and where can they find The World According to Joan Didion?
The World According to Joan Didion is hopefully in your local bookstore. And if it's not, ask them to order it.
Request it.
Yes, I always want to say support your bookstores.
Yeah.
Barnes and Noble has been really fantastic about stocking it and supporting it. So it doesn't just have to be an indie bookstore. They've actually been really great. And of course, it's available on Amazon or from indiebound.org, any of the online sources. And I am on Instagram. My handle is Ms. Lady Evelyn. It's MSLadyEvelyn. I also have a blog called populismblog.wordpress.com. Very long. I know. I need to get a shorter version of it. I'm not real good about keeping up that blog.
It's a fun blog, though.
Thank you.
It's a fun blog. Yeah. I get it on my email. So thank you.
Better at keeping up Instagram.
Yeah. It's right there in front of us. Well, thank you so much, Evelyn McDonnell. I appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Melina.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and recommend on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.